Somewhere beneath your feet right now, the Earth is spinning a tiny fraction slower than it did 30 years ago, and one single structure is the reason why. Not a meteor, not a war, not a natural disaster. A wall of concrete built by human hands, so massive that when it filled with water, it physically shifted the mass of this planet and stretched the length of a day. I'm not exaggerating for effect. Scientists measured it, NASA confirmed it. And what's terrifying is that slowing the Earth wasn't even the point. It was a side effect, an afterthought, a footnote in the story of a river that had been killing people for 4,000 years, and a government that finally decided enough was enough. This is the story of the most ambitious, most dangerous, and most controversial engineering project in human history, and by the end of it, you'll understand why some of the smartest engineers on the planet spent 75 years saying it couldn't be done, and why, when they finally tried anyway, the river fought back with everything it had. Picture the Yangtze in the summer of 1931. No sirens, no warning systems. Just a wall of brown water rising through the night while entire villages slept. And by the time the sun came up, 3.7 million people were dead. Not all of them drowned. Most of them starved or caught disease in the flooded wreckage that followed, wading through waist-deep water with nowhere to grow food, nowhere to boil water, nowhere to run. It happened again in 1935. It happened again in 1954, killing 30,000 more and displacing 18 million people in a single season. For 4,000 years, Chinese engineers had tried to tame this river with levees, with canals, with prayers to river gods carved into cliffside temples. And for 4,000 years, the river had won. In 1919, a revolutionary named Sun Yat-sen looked at a map of the Yangtze and proposed something almost unthinkable: build a dam so large it could physically stop the third longest river on Earth. Everyone thought he was insane. The technology didn't exist, the money didn't exist, and honestly, the political stability to attempt something this dangerous didn't exist either. Decades passed. Mao Zedong revived. The dream in 1956, standing on the banks of the river and declaring that one day a wall of concrete would tame it, but his own engineers kept telling him no. Not because they didn't want to build it, but because the geology wasn't ready. The technology wasn't ready, and frankly, nobody on Earth had ever attempted anything at this scale before. So the idea sat there for another 38 years, gathering dust in government archives, while the river kept flooding, kept killing, kept reminding an entire nation that it hadn't been beaten yet. Then, in 1992, something happened that almost never happens in Chinese politics. A vote. The National People's Congress had to approve the Hydropower project, and when the ballots came in, nearly 1 in every 4 delegates either voted against it or abstained completely. Think about how extraordinary that is. In a system where dissent is rare and public disagreement is rarer, a quarter of the room looked at this project and said, quietly, this might be a mistake. They weren't wrong to worry. Building this dam meant drowning 1,300 archaeological sites, some of them holding secrets from the ancient Ba civilization, a culture that lived along these gorges 4,000 years ago and left behind hanging coffins wedged into cliff faces that no modern engineer has ever fully explained. It meant erasing entire cities, Fengdu, Wushan, Wangxian, and bulldozing. Every school, every market, every home below a single elevation line before the water could be allowed to rise. It meant displacing 1.3 million human beings, uprooting families who had lived in the same river valley for generations, and telling them their homes would soon exist only as memories, sitting silently at the bottom of a reservoir. And still, in December of 1994, the first trucks rolled in. 40,000 workers descended on a town called Sanduping, chosen after years of geological surveys because beneath its soil sat 100 meters of solid granite bedrock. Strong enough, engineers hoped, to hold back what was coming. But before a single drop of permanent concrete could be poured, they had to solve an almost impossible problem first. How do you build a dam in the middle of a river that never stops flowing? The answer was audacious. Give the river somewhere else to go. Through the winter of 1993, crews carved a diversion channel more than a kilometer long directly through solid rock, using 80,000 sticks of dynamite in the first year alone, blasting around the clock in shifts that never paused for holidays, weather, or exhaustion. And then, for the first time in recorded history, something happened that 4,000 years of flooding had never allowed. The main bed of the Yangtze River ran dry. The river that had swallowed millions of lives across generations was reduced for a moment to nothing but wet stone and abandoned fish, forced into a detour channel while an army of workers raced against a 6-year clock to build something strong enough to control it permanently. And what followed was one of the most punishing construction efforts ever attempted. Crews excavated over 100 million cubic meters of rock and earth straight out of the riverbed, blasting 40 meters deep in places just to reach granite, clean enough to build on. They built a stone cofferdam across sections of the exposed river, watching in real time as 30,000 cubic meters of water per second tried to reclaim every boulder they dropped into place. Then came 8 straight months pouring concrete over that stone wall, finally splitting the Yangtze in two and buying the engineers just enough dry ground to keep working. Pumps ran 24 hours a day, draining every drop that seeped back in, because the moment the pumps stopped, the river started winning again. And then, just when it seemed like the hardest part was behind them, the ground itself betrayed them. Deep in the granite foundation, engineers discovered a fracture, a hairline crack running through the exact bedrock the entire dam was supposed to rest on. Work stopped immediately. For 6 months, nobody poured a single meter of concrete, while crews injected 45,000 tons of grout directly into the rock, sealing every hidden fissure they could find, because a single unnoticed crack under a structure holding back 42 trillion liters of water wasn't a risk anyone was willing to take. When they finally finished, the foundation tested harder than the natural granite around it. Only then, on a cold December day in 1994, did the first permanent concrete of the Three Gorges Dam finally touch the ground. From that moment forward, the project became a war of inches fought in cubic meters. Each section poured 20 meters wide and 3 meters tall, cured, then built on again, over and over, in a rhythm that never stopped for 3 straight years. At its peak, crews poured 3 million cubic meters of concrete in a single year, a world record that stood for years afterward. But there was a catch nobody talks about. Concrete generates heat as it cures, and on a structure this massive, that heat can cause it to crack from the inside out before it ever hardens properly. So engineers made an unusual call: pour only at night, when temperatures dropped low enough to slow the chemical reaction, and thread the concrete with networks of cooling pipes running water below 26 degrees Celsius through the heart of the structure for 3 straight weeks per section, essentially refrigerating a wall the size of a mountain from the inside. By 1996, it had reached 30 meters. By 1998, 60. By the year 2000, 100 meters of concrete rose out of what used to be an empty riverbed. And the workers who lived through it still say you cannot understand the scale until you're standing directly beneath it, staring up at a single pour that hasn't technically stopped since 1994. But concrete alone wasn't the only battle. To let cargo ships pass through this new barrier, engineers had to blast a staircase of 5 separate lock chambers straight out of a mountain, each one 280 meters long, using nothing but hand tools and dynamite in spaces too tight for heavy machinery. The gates sealing each chamber weighed 850 tons apiece, so heavy that entirely new cranes had to be engineered just to lift them into position. And every single weld was x-rayed for hidden cracks, because if one gate failed, the entire lock system would become a dead, flooded trap with a 10,000-ton ship stuck inside it. Then, in 1998, disaster struck without warning. The Yangtze broke through part of the construction zone overnight, submerging 15 meters of finished work in a matter of hours. 72 hours of nonstop pumping followed, every single bolt inspected before crews dared pour another meter of concrete. And remarkably, they simply picked up where they left off, as if the river hadn't just reminded them who was really in charge. Then came November 8th, 1997, the single most dangerous day of the entire 11-year construction. This was the moment engineers had to fully redirect the Yangtze itself, forcing the full force of the river, 11,600 cubic meters of water per second, into the new channel permanently. There was no elegant technology for this. Crews used dump trucks and boulders, dropping one enormous rock into the current roughly every 30 seconds, physically wrestling the 3rd largest river on the planet into submission using brute force and nerve. It took 6 hours. Engineers who were there still say, decades later, that they genuinely weren't sure it was going to work until the moment it did. Deep beneath all of this, hidden inside the mountain itself, workers carved an underground powerhouse the length of 3 football fields laid end to end, built to house 32 turbines, each one the size of a 5-story building. The precision required inside that cavern is almost impossible to comprehend. A single turbine weighing 600 tons had to be balanced to within 1/10 of a millimeter, because at 75 revolutions per minute, even a microscopic imbalance would tear the entire machine apart from the inside. The copper coils powering these turbines were wound entirely by hand, because no machine on Earth at the time was considered precise enough to guarantee the tolerances required. Every single coil had to be functionally identical to the ones beside it. Getting the power out meant stringing 500,000-volt transmission lines 1,000 kilometers to Shanghai, with workers climbing every single tower by hand along the entire route. And as the reservoir behind the dam began to fill, an entirely new danger emerged that almost nobody outside the engineering community saw coming: landslides. Between 2003 and 2009, more than 100 separate landslides tore down the hillsides surrounding the new reservoir, the result of ancient dry soil suddenly saturated with water for the first time in millennia. In response, engineers scrambled to stabilize 3,000 separate slopes before the water could rise high enough to destabilize them completely, because the alternative, a landslide triggering a wave inside a reservoir holding 42 trillion liters of water, was almost too catastrophic to model. Beneath the surface of that reservoir today sits an entire drowned city. Fengdu, once home to 80,000 people, its streets, its schoolyards, its markets, all still down there, frozen in cold water, untouched since the day the flood came, divers who have gone down. To document it, described furniture still standing where families left it, doors still hanging on their hinges. An entire slice of ordinary human life sealed away like a museum nobody is allowed to visit. In June of 2006, engineers detonated 200 tons of dynamite to demolish the temporary cofferdam that had protected the construction site for over a decade, releasing 186,000 cubic meters of rubble in 4 seconds, and allowing the full, undivided Yangtze to pass through the dam's turbines for the very first time since the river had been split apart in 1997. 3 years earlier, in June of 2003, the very first turbine had already spun to life, sending the project's first electricity into the Chinese power grid, and from that point forward, roughly one new turbine came online every few months until 2012, each one adding another 700 megawatts of capacity. By 2006, the main dam body itself stood complete. 185 meters tall and 2,309 meters wide, officially the largest dam ever constructed by human beings. But even with the dam finished, one problem remained unsolved. The traditional lock system took nearly 4 hours for a single ship to pass through, a bottleneck threatening to strangle river traffic entirely. So engineers built something almost nobody expected: a ship elevator, capable of lifting a vessel weighing 3,000 tons a full 130 meters in the air in under 40 minutes, essentially floating a ship up the side of a mountain using nothing but water and steel cables. Today, the numbers coming out of this structure are almost impossible to fully process. During peak flood season, the spillways can release 116,000 cubic meters of water per second, roughly 27 times the flow rate of Niagara Falls. The power station generates 22,500 megawatts on a good day, the equivalent output of 18 nuclear power plants, but without a single gram of nuclear fuel and without a single gram of carbon emissions, delivering electricity to 9 provinces and 2 major cities, powering roughly 80 million homes. And somewhere in the middle of all those numbers sits the detail that still sounds like science fiction. Because this reservoir holds so much water at such a significant elevation, it physically redistributed enough mass around the Earth's axis to measurably slow the planet's rotation, stretching the length of a single day by roughly 60 billionths of a second. It sounds insignificant until you understand what it actually represents. A human construction project large enough to alter the physics of the entire planet, not as a warning, not as a disaster, but as a documented, calculated side effect of moving enough water to fill a canyon longer than the entire width of England. But none of this came without cost, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The World Bank refused to fund this project outright, citing environmental risks too severe to justify supporting. 1,000 hectares of some of the most fertile farmland in China now sit permanently underwater, and the families who once lived off it were relocated to steep, rocky hillside terraces that produce roughly half the yield their old land once did, land that fed. Generations gone, replaced with something that barely sustains one. The Yangtze River dolphin, a species that had survived in this river for 20 million years, was last spotted in 2002 and formally declared extinct in 2022, its migratory path permanently severed by a wall of concrete it had no way of understanding. The Yangtze sturgeon, a living fossil older than the dinosaurs, remains critically endangered today, its spawning grounds disrupted by a dam it cannot swim around. Downstream, reduced sediment flow is quietly eroding riverbanks faster than nature ever intended. And here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. The city of Shanghai, home to over 24 million people, sits on sediment deposited by this very river over thousands of years. Less sediment moving downstream doesn't just mean smaller sandbars. It means the physical ground beneath one of the largest cities on Earth may be slowly, quietly sinking, and scientists are still trying to fully calculate what that means for the decades ahead. In the first decade after the reservoir filled, the region recorded over 3,000 minor earthquakes, a direct result of hundreds of millions of tons of water, pressing down onto deep fault lines that had sat undisturbed for millions of years. Engineers had projected roughly 700 landslide risk zones around the new reservoir. They found 5,000. The reservoir didn't just fill a valley, it reshaped the geological pressure of an entire region, And the full consequences of that are still being measured today, decades later. And yet, when the true test came, the dam held. In 2008, a devastating earthquake struck Sichuan province, roughly 500 kilometers away, killing tens of thousands of people and leveling entire towns. Engineers around the world held their breath, certain this would be the moment that proved the dam's critics right. It didn't. The structure held completely, without a single structural failure, and the questions about its long-term safety, rather than disappearing, only grew more complicated, because holding once doesn't guarantee holding forever. During a severe drought in 2022, the reservoir's water level dropped 10 meters in a matter of months, causing the dam's power output to fall by nearly 40% almost overnight. A stark, uncomfortable reminder that even a structure capable of altering the Earth's rotation is still ultimately dependent on rainfall it cannot control. Meanwhile, the dam faces a slower, quieter enemy that never stops working. Roughly 40 million tons of silt flow into the reservoir every single year, gradually settling and rising along the reservoir floor, forcing engineers to conduct annual controlled flushes through the spillways just to keep the system functional. It works for now, but only partially, and the sediment keeps coming back every single year without exception. Perhaps most unsettling of all, the dam itself sits directly on a known fault line, a fact geologists have understood since 1959, decades before construction ever began. Monitoring never stops. Sensors run continuously around the clock, watching for the smallest sign of movement, because the people who built this structure know something the rest of us often forget. The concrete is still hardening. It takes roughly 100 years for concrete this thick to reach its full theoretical strength, provided it stays consistently wet, which means the wall holding back 42 trillion liters of water is technically still not finished curing. Since the ship elevator opened in 2015, over 200,000 vessels have been lifted through it without a single mechanical breakdown and without a single significant delay. A genuinely remarkable engineering track record by any global standard. Inside the dam, maintenance crews walk through internal inspection tunnels every single week, searching for the faintest sign of water seepage through the concrete. So far, they say they've never found any. But every engineer connected to this project will tell you the same uncomfortable truth if you ask them directly. This structure has a lifespan. Best estimates put it somewhere between 100 and 150 years. Before sediment buildup, geological pressure, or simple material fatigue eventually wins the fight the Yangtze has been fighting for 4,000 years. There is currently no long-term solution for what happens after that point. China knows this. The engineers know this. And still, somewhere along a hillside near what used to be a flooded village, there's an old woman sitting quietly on a bench above the reservoir, staring down at the exact spot where her home used to stand before the water came, and no amount of clean electricity, no amount of flood control, no amount of scientific achievement can fully answer whether what was gained here was worth everything and everyone that was left behind beneath the surface. They said it couldn't be done. Geologists said the ground wasn't stable. Engineers said the technology wasn't ready. Delegates in a room that almost never disagrees looked at this project and said, quietly, maybe we shouldn't. And humanity built it anyway, at a cost of $31.7 billion, 17 years, and 1.3 million displaced lives, creating a structure so massive it altered the rotational speed of an entire planet, all to finally answer a question the Yangtze River had been asking for 4,000 years. Could it ever truly be tamed? The answer, sitting in the dark underground, still curing, still being watched, still fighting a silt problem with no permanent fix, is complicated. It's not simply yes. It's not simply no. It's the most honest answer engineering has ever given. Not yet, and maybe not forever, but for now. Against every historical odd stacked against it, it's holding. Arda.